questo incontro va anche in diretta streaming e rimarrà depositato per sempre nella memoria della rete. Quindi se siamo pronti cominciamo. Io dico che sono molto contento di essere qui a parlare con Keret per molti motivi, perché ha scritto un libro bellissimo, poi ne parliamo, e perché mi è capitato, ma questo conta poco, di incontrarlo forse una dozzina di anni fa a Mantova al Festival del Giornalismo, dove aveva scritto un libro per bambini, pieno di bambini, si intitolava Papà è scappato col circo, che era un libro bellissimo che raccontava molto bene quel pezzo di mondo di quando siamo bambini e di cosa significa essere bambini e avere a che fare con una strana figura che chiamiamo babbo, padre. Ed era già un libro bellissimo, e adesso è passato un po' di tempo, Etgar ha avuto un figlio e credo che anche, ma questa è la mia supposizione, poi glielo chiedo, in base a questo ha scritto una cosa bellissima, 7 anni di felicità, 7 anni che stanno fra la nascita di un figlio e quindi tutti gli interrogativi che porta. Io dei miei ricordo l'interrogativo di base, che bello aver avuto un figlio quando se ne andrà, e alla fine in questi 7 anni una questione molto molto umana, talmente umana che noi umani a volte non riusciamo a raccontarla bene, è quella di un pezzo di noi che se ne va quando se ne va nostro padre. E tutto questo, un filo conduttore temporale bellissimo, raccontato con dei bellissimi frammenti di narrazione, di episodi in cui c'è molto il luogo, che è chiaramente Israele, c'è molto, credo, quello che stiamo facendo qui, cioè il mestiere non solo di scrittore, e Keret è un bravissimo scrittore, ma di scrittore al tempo dei festival, che alla fatica dello scrivere gli tocca aggiungere il piacere, ma credo anche la fatica, e poi forse a volte il rompimento di cabasisi, non so come si traduce cabasisi, di andare in giro per il mondo a raccontare il lavoro di scrittore, e andando in giro per il mondo, se uno è bravo, poi scrive delle altre cose. E quindi gli chiedo una cosa che ho letto in un'intervista che ha rilasciato all'ANSA, per vedere se l'ANSA, il sito di informazione più importante d'Italia, scrive le cose giuste, e gli chiedo se è vero che questo libro, il suo primo libro autobiografico, lo è talmente tanto che non esce in Israele.
Yes, it's true. For now, I chose not to publish it in Israel because whenever you publish a fiction book, you can get bad reviews and people can tell you your characters are boring. But when you write a biographical review, and people can say to you, you know, the part about your father dying was very boring, or I think your son is a very weak character, you know, then it's something that I think I could have lived with, but it would have been very tough for my mother. And because I know that my mother can be very angry and carry a grudge, I thought that, you know, I'll save her this risk, and I won't publish it elsewhere. I think that, you know, there are those kinds of secrets or intimate things that it's much easier to share with a stranger sitting next to you in a plane or in a train than to really share it with your next door neighbor who you're going to meet in the elevator, you know, the next day.
Sì, credo che ci sia, è molto vero, ci sono due tipi di storie, quelle da condividere con le persone più care, gli amici, e quel tipo di storie particolari che si condividono, come dicevi un attimo fa, si condividono con gli sconosciuti, quelli conosciuti appunto sul sedile di un treno o nella sala di attesa di un aeroporto. Ce n'è un'altra categoria di raccontare storie, ma qui ci metto del mio, e sono le storie condivise quando uno racconta qualcosa al proprio psicanalista, un terapeuta. A me è venuto un po' da pensarlo perché la profondità del racconto che Keret fa appunto nelle sue narrazioni. Gli è mai capitato di cimentarsi e di avere a che fare con le narrazioni che si fanno ai terapeuti? Non gli sto chiedendo se è seguito dai servizi di salute mentale di Tel Aviv, gli sto chiedendo se conosce questo, perché me l'ha fatto pensare. Sto già violando la privacy del nostro autore.
Well, I must say that, I grew up with parents who were Holocaust survivors, and for them the concept of going to a psychologist meant that you were crazy. People who are normal don't go to psychologists, Like, I don't know, you don't get surgery unless you're in a very, very severe state, and you don't go to talk to a stranger about your problems unless you're in deep trouble. And also the concept is that that you talk to somebody and then you have to pay him, and I talk so much, I always had a feeling that I could never afford it. So I guess that my writing came instead of psychotherapy.
Credo che sia un bel vantaggio, anche perché sì, anche perché dopo aver raccontato una storia non devi chiedere all'altro di farti la fattura, che è il minimo ma importante. Salto di palo in frasca, tu citavi tua madre e, nei viaggi di scrittura, nei viaggi concreti che racconti nei racconti di 7 anni di felicità, c'è il tornare in Polonia, che è il posto da cui sono venuti i genitori, la madre polacca, e c'è una cosa bellissima in questo viaggio profondo, non solo fisico. A un certo punto tua mamma ti dice, e credo che voglia farti i complimenti, ma chi le capisce, le madri, che tu non sei soltanto un bravo scrittore israeliano, ma sei, me lo sono segnato, sembri quasi uno scrittore polacco in esilio. E quindi ti volevo chiedere se ci racconti come dentro di te stanno tutte queste cose, perché ti dico, fammi da psicanalista. Io sono figlio di 2 genitori e tutta la nostra famiglia, andando indietro con la memoria, siamo arrivati scavando nei registri parrocchiali fino a 250 anni fa. In 250 anni le famiglie di mia mamma e di mio papà si sono mosse di 600 metri e quindi ho grande invidia per chi ha delle radici così lontane. Dici qualcosa delle tue radici e di come influenzano questi. Io sono della provincia di Prato, sai che tristezza.
Actually, I've been to Prato, and I think that this is where my wife got pregnant. So we give Prato a lot of credit. But I think maybe this is due to the fact that you don't have many things to do at night there, So, but
non farmi piangere, ti prego.
But I want to say something that it's funny, I think we're always jealous of what we don't have. And I think that for me, when I grew up and I looked at my past, it was always a black hole. I didn't know my grandparents who died during the Holocaust. I never got to see the house in which any of my parents got born. I didn't know how to speak their mother tongue. And whenever I would go with my wife and she would take me to her great-grandparent house and show me the trees that he planted with his own hand, I would start crying, and she thought that it was because I cared so much for her family, but it was mostly because I really feel that there is something, I often define Israel, I call Israel the limbo sandwich, because I feel that many people like me, we come from a past that is non-existent. It's a black hole, and we gaze into a future that is very scary, with Iranian nuclear weapon and with Syria and with all our neighboring country. So there is a black hole in the future, and we're surviving between those two pieces of a bun on this very, very thin slice of a present. And the truth is that whenever I come to Italy and I see in a small town a barber sitting outside his barber shop with the sun hitting his face, I say, you know, maybe his father was a barber, maybe his son would be a barber, but you know, I don't know my grandparents. I'm not even certain that my son will have maybe the ability to grow up in the same country that I lived in. You know, there's so many different bad scenarios, from wars to the country becoming so extreme right-wing that it will be unlivable, you know, as an unfunctioning democracy. So there is this yearning for or jealousy, envy of somebody who can be so certain of his identity and his roots that he doesn't have to ask himself those kind of questions. You know, imagine that I come from a country that if you ask me if in 100 years from now, will my language will be spoken on this earth? And I can't give you a certain yes, you know. While I think that, you know, that if the worst case scenario Italians maybe can think of is what? That they'll be invaded by Switzerland, you know. I can give you 50 different scenarios of my country's destruction from within and from without, you know. So I blame some of my Jewish anxiety also of the geopolitical reality in which I have to live.
È molto bello quello che hai detto. Ti chiedo un'altra cosa personale e poi giuro che non ti faccio più fare il mio psicanalista, ma è una cosa personale ma che però fotografa, io credo, un pezzetto di questo paese. Tu puoi aiutarci facendolo il confronto con la tua realtà. Tu dicevi la questione delle radici, la questione del futuro. Lo dico in maniera personale. Tutti noi qui in Italia, qui in Europa, veniamo dall'aver dentro la considerazione, la sicurezza che fino adesso le cose andavano bene, ma nel senso, lo dico meglio, mi scuso. Mio nonno faceva il contadino, mio babbo faceva l'artigiano, mio babbo era sicuro, e lo erano tutti quelli come lui, che la sua vita sarebbe stata normalmente migliore di quella dei suoi genitori. Io sono stato cresciuto sapendo che comunque andasse, per tutti noi, per com'era disegnata questa società, la nostra vita sarebbe stata un po' meglio di quella che è capitato ai nostri genitori. Lo sintetizzava molto bene mia mamma, che diceva: ma guarda com'è tuo babbo ha sempre lavorato, a te ti danno soldi per dire scemate. Credo che avesse colto questo. Adesso io, ma credo tutti noi, tanti di noi qui in Italia, ma credo che sia un discorso di tutta l'Europa, abbiamo perso la certezza che i miei figli potranno avere un futuro, che questa cosa che si chiama l'ascensore sociale. Che visione hai di questo in un paese che è attraversato da interrogativi più alti sul futuro? Sono stato abbastanza confuso.
No, not at all. I can tell you that, you know, I live in Israel, but because I travel, I see what's going on in Italy and actually all over the world. I really think that, you know, that there is something about human societies. It's a little bit like a pendulum, you know. It goes to one side and goes to the other. And I think that, you know, that if since the Second World War there was this feeling of things getting better and better and better, now there is a global feeling of things getting worse, you know, consistently worse. And I think that, you know, there is a global economical crisis from which some countries, like Italy, suffer more than the others, but it's still something that is felt all around. And the thing that even bothers me more, it's the fact that I think that we lived in an era where the idea was that when you lived in a country, people could disagree, but they belonged to the same people, you know? And I feel that in Israel it's very, very extreme. I think that in Italy it's not the same. But I feel that now many times when you live in a country, you feel that there are two tribes that have very, very little in common. You know, it's like, I think, let's say, during a Berlusconi regime, I would go here, and most of the Italian people that I met, which were a certain intelligentsia, you know, they would say, this guy doesn't represent us. Who is this guy, you know? Who are the people who are voting for him? It's almost as if, like, you know, you take a Milan and a Juventus fans, you know, that the Italian people, they wear different color shirt, and they cannot feel this kind of unity that they felt before. And I think that this idea of a dichotomy inside nationality, and not only those dichotomy, but the fact that the conflicts become more extreme, and this general idea of the fact that, you know, that we basically share the same space, we share the same roots, we each in our own way want a better future for our children, is beginning to disappear globally. I really believe that in some senses, Israel is the tip of the iceberg. Many things that came to Israel and hit us hard are now beginning to reach Europe. You know, for example, Islamic fundamentalism is something that Israel had strongly suffered from for the past 20 years. But if in the past, when I would have to try to explain to somebody in Europe, what does it mean, what's terrorism, what's jihad, what's all those things, now it is already reaching the society, together with xenophobia, racism against Arabs, which are things that also in Israel we knew a long time before, you know. So I really, it's not necessarily that if it came out in any way that I think that I'm living in a very unbalanced place with uncertain future and Italy is heaven, then, you know, it's not what I meant. I really feel that the entire world is shaking, and that sometimes, you know, that in some places you are closer to the center of the thing that makes it shake, but we share the same planet and we share the same problems.
Senti, ti propongo di entrare direttamente nelle pagine di 7 anni di felicità, anche perché sennò finisce che io ti parlo dei miei problemi e a te viene da citare Berlusconi e la mia miscuglio potrebbe essere veramente esplosivo e depressivo. A un certo punto sono le pagine che a me sono piaciute di più, racconti una piccola storia che inizia col fatto che tu ti senti incapace di dire di sì e di dire di no, e quindi dici di sì. E dici di sì più volentieri quando la promessa che fai dicendo di sì è più avanti nel tempo, nei mesi, e così poi per aver detto di sì ti trovi a passare la notte in un museo croato e lì scrivi una cosa bellissima sulle parole la guerra. Ce lo racconti questo pezzetto del museo croato, di dire di sì? Mi è piaciuto moltissimo, e anche se le persone lo ascoltano poi gli verrà tolto dalla mente dalla Feltrinelli e compreranno il libro lo stesso.
Well, you know, I think the piece is a bit long, but I think that the thing that stayed with me most from this trip was the fact that I met a cafe owner, you know, a coffee place owner, and he told me that for a very long time in former Yugoslavia, Italians tried to export coffee, you know, to have espressos there and cappuccinos, but the Yugoslavians resisted. They liked their old-time coffee. But in the time where they had a social tensions and a civil war, then apparently when you go to a cafe and you order a cafe, you do it in a different way. If you ask for a cafe in a Croatian, or if you ask for a cafe in Serbian, or if you ask for a cafe in any other kind of one of the former Yugoslavian nationality. And people who would go to a cafe, the last thing that they want would be to order a cafe in Croatian, and the guy actually supports the Serbian, I don't know, he's going to spit in the coffee in a best case scenario or punch them in a worst case scenario. So they start entering cafe and say, can I have an espresso? Because espresso is Italian. Italian is neutral, so you don't have to show who you're committed to, when you order a cafe. And this way, Lavazza and all the Italian companies were able to enter the Yugoslavian markets. They needed to have a Balkan war to get it going. It's not such an initiative, but suddenly everybody wanted the Italian coffee. But if I talk about espresso, if I may, I really want to tell a story which is not in the book about my late father, who was my late father was the person I know who liked Italian coffee, espresso, the most in the world. I've never seen anybody who knew how to enjoy a coffee and a cigarette as much as my father. My father spent almost a year in Italy because after the Second World War, the British controlled Israel, so he was unable to come in, and he supported the Israeli resistance fighting the British by living in Reggio Calabria and buying firearms from the Cosa Nostra for the people who are fighting in Israel. And because he didn't have any money to live in a proper hotel, his Cosa Nostra friends, they put him in a whorehouse they owned. So he lived for a year in a whorehouse in Reggio Calabria, and always my father would tell me, this was the best year in my life, So, so when he came back to Israel, to live his new life, so the thing, his connection to Italy, except for the fact that he spoke bad Italian and he always liked to try to speak to people in Italian, was to drink espresso. And when he became ill, he had a smoker's cancer in the base of his throat, which at some stage, when it became bigger and bigger, it made him unable to eat or drink, and he was fed through his stomach directly. And the thing about this thing is that it blocks the things that brings food to your stomach. So if he would try to drink water, they would go straight to his lungs. So it would be like drowning, not like drinking. And so he was not allowed to swallow anything. And when I would take him to physiotherapy, we would always pass next to this very small cafe that would have a big sign, Italian coffee. And my father would smell it. And he'd say, I have a hunch this is the best cafe in town. I tell you, I can smell it. And one time when we came from the physiotherapy, he said, why don't we sit here? And I said to him, Father, you cannot drink. So he said, yes, but you can drink. So I said, okay. And we both sat there, and I ordered a drink. And before the waitress leave, my father says, and one double espresso for me. And I look at him, and he's like a child who did something wrong. He goes, like, what can I do? I say, okay, maybe he wants to smell the coffee, whatever he wants, And they give me my drinks, they give him his espresso, and the moment she puts it on the table, he grabs it, and he drinks it in one shot, And the moment that he drinks it, it goes straight to his lungs. It's like, imagine yourself being drowned in a sea of boiling espresso. It burns to his lungs, and he stands up, and he's like, he made those terrible noises in the middle of the cafe. One guy gets up, he said, I'm a doctor. I say, okay, I don't know if you can help us, you're a doctor, but he's not supposed to drink. And after something that looked like eternity, but was maybe 20 seconds of him suffocating and me holding him, he went like this and kind of threw up the entire coffee in the middle of the cafe. And the second that he did that, he sat down like nothing, took out cigarette, lit his cigarette, looked at me, and he said, you see, I told you, this is the best cafe in town.
Grazie davvero di averci raccontato una cosa così intima. Allora approfitto per chiederti, se non sbaglio, questo libro, 7 anni di felicità, è il primo direttamente, palesemente autobiografico. Tu scrivi da quanto? Da 20-30 anni, insomma. E cos'è cambiato proprio nello scrivere, invece di raccontare grandi storie, scrivere proprio di sé. Una domanda che farebbe Marzullo, mi reso conto dopo averla fatta, però ormai lo fa. Non traducete Marzullo, vi prego.
No, I actually think it's a great question. I think that for me, if you'd ask me to define myself as a writer, of course, I see myself as a fiction writer. And I think that since the day I started writing, whenever I would be able to invent a character, invent a plot, invent a story, I would be proud of myself like a little creator, like a little god. And the idea of writing nonfiction never interested me because it didn't seem to be as much of a challenge or as much fun. I always say that when you write a fiction piece, you go out on an adventure. But when you write a nonfiction piece, you only retell an adventure that had already happened. You don't surprise yourself because you tell something that had existed. So I never thought I'd write a nonfiction book. And by the way, I'm not sure I write another one. I actually think that I won't write another one. But what happened was that since the day that my son was born, I began writing to myself some pieces about it, some publishing them for a newspaper, in the New York Times, or in other, sometimes in the Corriere della Sera.
Sì, vero.
And I would just do it because I would have this urge to write it, but I never thought of making a book out of it. And then I was in a literary festival, and one of the writers that I really, really love, his name is Alexander Raymond. He lives in the US, but he's originally from former Yugoslavia, was in the audience. And at the time, it was really just, I think it was even before my father had died, but I would go on events and I would have this uncontrollable urge to talk about my father. It was almost like when you're a child and you want to show off and to say to people, my father is better than your father, my father is stronger than your father. Then I would do a book reading, but somehow I would find an excuse, like now, to tell a story about my father, like I did today, And Alexander Raymond, who was in the audience, and it's really a writer I admire, came to me after it, and he said, I really like the event, it's very nice. And he said to me, can I say to you something personal? And I said to him, what? He said, you need to write a book about your father. He said, not for the readers, for yourself. You need to do that. And I didn't understand this remark so much, but when my father died, and a few months after my father died, it became a stronger and stronger feeling for me that going on stages and telling people my father is better than yours is not enough, It's that I have to create some kind of a tombstone, and for me, a tombstone for my father would be maybe acknowledging his greatest yearning and fantasy and his greatest achievement, and what it was the ability to create a family and to continue a lineage. Because when my family, both my parents were in the Second World War, their greatest dream was to survive this war, which killed everybody. Like my mother lost both her parents. She saw her mother and kid brother killed in front of her eyes. My father lost his kid sister. So the first thing was to survive the war and to be undamaged enough, physically and mentally, to be able to find a partner and to be undamaged enough to have a child and to be sane enough not to make this child crazy, so when he'll grow up, he'll find somebody who'll be willing to marry him and give him a child. This was a dream for them. I think that for them it looked less attainable than for Mark Zuckerberg to become a billionaire. When they were kids during the war, the idea is that they'll be able to do that. They knew that maybe one of 100 will be able to attain that. So this was always my father's greatest pride, the fact that he had grandchildren, He had my child as a grandchild. My sister is an ultra-Orthodox, so she has She had gave him 12 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren. And this was for him the sense of achievement that he won a gold medal in the Olympics. So for me, writing this book was basically putting it in the paper. You were a great father. Thanks to you, I was able to raise up my child. I'm not sure I'm doing it well, but I promise you that I'm doing the best I can to do that. And it was the need to put this book out. And I must say, you know, to be honest, when this book was written, my books are published in 37 languages, and I had to go from publisher to publisher and to fight that they'll publish this book. It's like in the US, I had to leave my publisher and go to another publisher because they refused to publish this book. And what my publisher said in some of the countries, not in Italy, but they said, look, you're the only Israeli writer who you have many fans who don't even know that you're Israeli. You create a fantastical world. You tell stories that have nothing to do with your nationality or your identity. Not only this book would not be of interest for your readers, but you're going to lose future readers. You know, it's a mistake, you know. And I tell you, for the first time in my life, I never do future deals for books. I had to sign a 2 books contract with publishers saying, you know what, publish these books that nobody's going to read. I'm going to do another one that will be a bestseller, okay? And I'm gladly I can say to you now that the book, you know, that it was my biggest commercial success in France, in Spain, and in other countries. But this was against the prediction of my publisher. And yet, even when I was sure that this book will not be read, I was willing to fight and to do anything, you know, not to get advances for it, to promise I come to 10 festivals every time, just to have this printed tombstone for my father to say, hey, you got it right. You did what you fantasized as a teenager or as a kid. You got it, you know. You knocked the ball out of the park, you know.
Che bella storia. Che bella storia. I padri, coltivare il ricordo dei padri è importante quanto coltivare buoni rapporti con gli editori, ma forse un po' di più. Ti chiedo un'altra cosa, a me piace molto quello che scrivi perché hai un pezzetto bellissimo di quella cosa che chiamiamo ironia, autoironia, che è un misto di profondità e di leggerezza. A un certo punto tua moglie ti dice, fai dire a tua moglie sul fatto che tu forse non ti alimenti proprio bene e mangi porcate, tua moglie ti dice: chiunque trattasse un animale domestico nel modo in cui tu tratti il tuo corpo sarebbe stato messo in prigione e da un pezzo. Ti volevo chiedere, mangi veramente così male? E 2, da dove arriva questa ironia, questa capacità di è un pezzo di tua mamma, di tuo papà? Dove sono le radici?
Well, first of all, it is very true that I eat badly. You know, when I met my wife, I had in my kitchen, I didn't have any gas. I had only an electric kettle. And basically what I would eat only 2 things. I would eat hummus, you know, and I would boil eggs in the kettle. You know, because if you put an egg in electric kettle and you do it like 2 or 3 times, so I would eat hummus and eggs. And this was my entire dietary supplement. And if they would, on my birthday, I would order a pizza, you know. But this, I think, also has to do with my upbringing and with my parents. That the idea was that basically food was necessary to survive, you know. If you want to have fun, go look for it somewhere else. And I think that there is something with my parents. Maybe it's kind of a strange digression, but the idea was that my parents were never able to get formal education. They were never able to find the work that they wanted to work in. if you look at my mother was orphaned when she was about 9 or 10 years old with no family in the world, and basically her job was to find something warm to wear, something to eat. And when they had a family, my parents always looked at us and said to us, what we want for you or for your brother and sister, we want you to transcend. In that sense, like my father said to me, he was unable to articulate it to me, but he said to me, if 30 years from now, you will be a rich dentist with a beautiful house and beautiful wife and beautiful children, and that's it, I would be utterly disappointed of you. And I think that the image I always had in my mind was that my parents carried me on their back until they reached this wall, and they said, climb on our back to get to the other side. Do something that is not materialistic. We don't know what you can do in life that is not materialistic because we never had a chance. But this is your responsibility. So when I grew up, all this idea of, eating well, living well, was not important. The idea was to find a way over the fence to transcend, to do something that is less than eating, going to the toilet, taking a shower, doing something that would transcend that. And when you talk about irony or humor, I do think I got it from my parents. I do think I got it from my heritage. I think, people talk about Jewish humor, and I think Jewish humor exists, and I can tell two things about Jewish humor. One, the first thing is that humor is always the weapon of the weak. If you can change reality, you can change it. If you can't, you make a joke about it, We usually make jokes about our bosses, Our bosses don't make jokes about us. They don't need to make jokes. They can fire us, We make jokes about death, Death doesn't make jokes about us. It just kills us, So when you are powerless against reality and you want to keep your dignity, the best way to protest without being pathetic or getting punched is to make a joke. And the second thing I want to say specifically about Jewish humor is that, I'm son of immigrants, and there is something about the diaspora Jews that they always carry two identities. For example, if you were an Italian Jew, you were both Italian and a Jew. And this can give you the benefit of two-tier thinking, which means you could go in the street of Rome and see Italians doing something and say, what are those crazy Italians doing? And you could say it as a Jew. And then you could go to synagogue and look at the other Jews praying, and you say, what are those crazy Jews doing? And you could say it as an Italian. And this ability to be reflexive, both an insider and an outsider, it's the most fundamental Jewish trait. If you look at let's say the most successful or innovating Jews in history or modern history, people like Albert Einstein, Freud, Kafka, Karl Marx, the amazing thing about them is that they knew how to work inside their disciplines, but they also knew how to look at their discipline from the outside. Einstein knew Newton's physics, but he could also say, who are those crazy Newtonians, speaking from another point of view. And I think that this is also very typical of Jewish humor, because when you do this, then basically sometimes to be ironical, you need to alienate yourself from the people you make a joke of. But with Jews, you can alienate yourself from them, but at the same time stay close and love them. Jewish humor is always about the people you love the most. Jewish jokes are about your wife and about your mother and about the people who are closest to you. Jews very often not tell funny stories that are about Jews, because the idea you're not going to waste your irony on somebody who's not worth your irony. And this is not always the case. Many times I see American movies when they make fun of white trash or people who live in Texas, and the writer is actually a very sophisticated American guy who never been to Texas and read about it in Wikipedia, and he can say, hey, look at those guys, they're stupid. But I think that the kind of humor that I use by heritage is really a humor that is basically a way to send emotion. my late father said to me once, he said, I read all your stories, one after the others, and I looked at all the father characters, and he said, I can tell you statistically that half of the fathers in your stories are stupid, and the other half die. But what I can tell you is that all those stories have in common is that in each and every one of them, when I read them, I feel how much you love me. And this is, I think, something very typical of Jewish humor.
Grazie, è veramente molto bello. Mi dicono che abbiamo ancora qualche minuto, quindi è il momento di fare qualche domanda nello spirito del Festival del giornalismo. Credo che dobbiate farle da qua per un'esigenza di ripresa. No, abbiamo un microfono volante perché il Festival del giornalismo non bada a spese. Mentre ci pensate ti chiedo una cosa al volo molto concreta. Quando scrivi? Scrivi al mattino? Sei sistematico? Sei ossessivo, scrivi con metodo, aspetti il momento, bevi tè mentre scrivi?
Well, I must say that I'm very opportunistic when it comes to writing. You know, if I have to, as a writing animal, if I have to pick an animal that I'm like, I think I'm very much like a cockroach, you know. I can survive nuclear attacks, you know, and eat the glue out of the wallpaper when I write. And I think that, you know, I don't have any writing routine. I actually don't even have a normal place to write in. I have this very little corner between the kitchen and our living room, and whenever I have a chance, you know, my son plays with the ball outside, or my wife, you know, doesn't want me to help with something, I sit down and I write as quickly as I can. But you know, I always, it's funny because when I talk to my son, I think I always reflect that. And especially when I talk a lot to my wife's family, because my wife comes from a family that everybody is an artist there. Her brother is a singer and their father is a poet, and I always say to them, in the place where we differ, that I always feel that life is more important than stories. So if I could be a little better father or a little better son, or if I could be a little better husband, or if I could be a little better writer, I would choose one of the first things. I want to be a better person much more than I want to be a better writer. So I think that for me, fiction is always secondary to what you do in the life around you. So I can pass months without writing because I help my mother, because I do something of importance for my community. But the moment that I have some free time, I sit down and write.
Ci sono delle domande? Avete qualcosa da chiedere? Anch'io avevo sentito non sentiamo le voci solo io e lei, insomma, abbiamo sentito tutti, no. Allora chiedo io l'ultima cosa, sempre sulla scrittura, il libro I 7 anni di felicità sono stretti fra una presenza che arriva, un figlio che nasce e un'assenza, il vuoto del papà che non c'è più. Il vuoto, l'assenza è una cosa molto, molto potente, ma anche la presenza di un bambino, quei pannolini puzzolenti, i giocattoli sempre in giro. Ti ha cambiato il modo di scrivere?
Well, it's funny because I have a very close relationship I've always had a very close relationship to my parents, and in all my books I wrote many stories about the father and child relationship, and in all my stories they were from a point of view of a child. And the day I became a father, I still keep writing those stories, but now I write them from the perspective of a father. It's funny how your identity changes overnight. I think that even when I was 30 years old, I saw myself as a child in terms of responsibility, in terms of being able to live in the present and not ask yourself questions of the future. And the moment that my child was born, my life was changed. I think that because again, for my parents, having children was their greatest achievement. So for us, we always grew up feeling like how happy and lucky our parents felt to be with us. So even before I had a child, I grew up, from an idea that, that having a child is the most amazing thing in your life. And I think that there is something about it that it's almost kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The moment that you get into life this way, then it becomes so easy. I can tell you something about writing, that all my life I wrote at night, because in my compulsory army service I worked night shifts. So all my life the hours I would write would be between midnight and 4 a.m. Now when I became a father, my son every day, doesn't matter what time he goes to sleep, since he was born, he wakes up between 5:30 and 6 a.m. And when he wakes up, very quickly he discovered that it's better surviving strategy to wake up me and not my wife. When he was about 7 years old, we had a talk, and he said to me, "Tell me, Father, if I want to wake you up every day 5:30 or 6 a.m., and when he wakes me up in Israel, we have good weather, so many times we go 6 a.m., we go swimming in the beach in Tel Aviv, or we go playing football, or we have this cafe that is open 24 hours, and we go and sit in the cafe and we do crosswords, puzzle, and stuff like that." So one day he said to me, if I wouldn't wake you up, wouldn't it be boring for you to go to the beach alone or to do the crossroads? So I said to him, no, actually, I think I would have slept, for longer. And he said to me, but for all those years, I don't remember even one time that I woke you up and that the first thing you did when you opened your eyes wasn't smiling. And I said to him, it's not because I like to be waking up, but when I open my eyes, I see you, so what can I do but smile?
Io ringrazio Lisa Clark e il suo collega per la traduzione, ringrazio molto Etgar Keret per le cose belle che scrive e per la generosità con cui poi racconta di quello che scrive e di come lo scrive. Grazie davvero.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, it was a great pleasure. Thank you, Massimo.
Grazie. Buona serata.
Thank you.
Grazie mille. Molto